Thank you all for joining us for a special edition of Talks at Columbia, Redefining Teamwork, the Evolution of Collaboration. We've had a chance to talk today about teamwork and collaboration from three different perspectives. So we have the scholar model from Peter, who was able to talk to us about teamwork and collaboration from the point of view of research. We have the practitioner model, an executive who was able to talk to us about running Celebrity Cruise and the broad dynamic industry that is travel and what celebrity has been able to do practically applied. And then we have the scholar practitioner in Ed, who was able to talk about both teaching and research as well as his work at NASA. So thank you all for joining us. One of the things that we've talked about with respect to teamwork and collaboration, and the theme that threaded each of your talks, was that you need a very strong and effective and competent leader in order to engage and facilitate the dynamics of and inner workings of a team. When I teach my leadership development class and organizational strategy class, one of the things that I always get asked is whether a leader can be learned in terms of learning what they need to do, or is it an innate trait that they are born with? So can you learn to be a leader, or do you have to be born with it? So Lisa, I'll start with you. As we think about teams and all the teams that you run, the 12 ships that you have porting and docking every day, do you think that leadership can be learned, or do you think that you need to just be born with it?
I think anyone can be a leader. I've seen a lot of people rise up to the leadership positions, but I don't think everyone can be a great leader. And I believe great leaders are born, and I believe that you have to think and be wired a certain way to get the ultimate performance out of a team. And I believe you can always nuance the things that you have that are good and you can build on, but if you don't have the traits of a great leader, then you really can't learn them. And I have seen leaders on ships who have been the leaders of a ship who have not been great leaders, and we've had to change them out just because they weren't able to get the results they needed because they weren't leading in the right way.
So what kind of traits do you need? Whether you're the CEO of Celebrity Cruise, whether you're the coach of the Golden State Warriors, whether you are a leader of another sort, what kinds of traits do you need to be able to engage these teams, be able to get them to follow you, to be able to understand and know the strategy and execute it, to take care of shareholders and other stakeholders, but also to be able to work with each other during times of transition and difficulty in particular?
Well, one of the things that was really interesting as I was listening to when we're talking about conflict within teams, and just because you're a great team, it doesn't mean that you always agree or you always get along every single day. But at the end of the day, people have to understand the team is more important than the individual. I always draw analogies to sports teams for great teams, because you always realize the teams that win championships aren't about a person, they're about the team. And as soon as someone puts themselves above the team, I don't believe you can win. One of the things that's interesting about our business, it's a very hierarchical industry, as you saw with the beautiful and amazing uniformed crew that I was standing with, the people that I work with every day. And if you get into a situation where it's hierarchical and one person is so much more important than the other, then people don't feel valued, and you don't get their hearts and minds, and you can't rally them around doing the right thing every day and helping us win. Then they work out of fear, and then that never gets a great result.
So Peter, let me shift to you. The research on teams and leadership in particular show that the way in which a team is structured has a lot to do with the overall performance of that team and whether or not they can execute against the bottom line. So how many people you have on the team, the profile, the skills, the gaps in skills, the way in which you articulate their roles and operating procedures. You talked in your talk a little bit about the emotional reservoirs. And so the ratio of engagement between, and I think you said 3.5 positive interactions for every one is what is needed for an organizational team to be able to function properly. Maybe a little bit higher, a higher number of positive interactions for people who live together, a married couple or partners, right? So when you have an organization like Lisa's, this ship, the Celebrity Infinity, where people work together and live together, what kind of dynamic is needed in order for that emotional reservoir to be high so that they can satisfy the customers, satisfy Lisa's strategic objectives, but at the same time be able to fill up that reservoir of good interaction so that when times of trouble come, they can satisfy those?
Great question, and it's probably a question we should ask you, but I'll give you my generic response from the research. And again, I always take averages like this with a grain of salt, because it depends on the team, it depends on what the task is, how long the team has to work together. Is it a task force? Is it an ongoing group? So there are a lot of differences that matter. Yeah, what they find in the research on marriage and families is because so much of that is social, emotional, sentimental, it's feelings, it's love, it's, conflict with siblings, right? That it's really important that there be sufficient positivity for them to be able to tolerate conflict. And in fact, there's a recent study on parenting, and parenting of particularly creative kids. And one of the things they found is that parents who actually have a lot of conflict but do it respectfully tend to raise children who are much more creative, because the children are seeing that conflict isn't something you avoid. This conflict is something you can do and gain from, right? And then you can thrive if you do it respectfully. So I think, particularly in an environment like this, where you have people, particularly at sea, who are living and working together, it probably moves closer to the family dynamics and the importance of having that kind of respect and positivity as a fundamental baseline. And you need conflict, right? You need to have people who are challenging one another's ideas. So I would imagine it probably moves a little bit. It's probably more important than a team that's really just focused purely on a task, like an engineering team. It's probably not completely 5 to 1, but somewhere between, so let's say 4 to 1.
Okay, all right. So Ed, let's turn to you, and let's also talk about Lisa's industry. So the hospitality industry, in order for the teams to work well and collaborate together, they're really focused on customer service and maximizing the experience of the passenger. When we talk about NASA and we talk about the space industry, we're not just talking about the customer experience. Now we're talking about safety. The priorities are safety and preservation of life, right? So when you're talking about collaboration in teams and the stakes are so high as to be talking specifically about life and death, what are some of the constraints? What are some of the best practices around ways that you can make that team function and satisfy the priority, which is such high stakes?
Right. So, I mean, when you're talking about, for NASA, it's almost divided into robotics and human exploration. And a lot of folks like the robotics part because you're not involved with people, which means you don't have loss of life, so you can take more risks, right? When you're involved in the high risk area, then partly it gets into that whole issue of risk management. What are the things that can go wrong? What are the things that you're looking at? And just being very disciplined in terms of addressing it. But I'll make a connection back to actually one of the things that each of, Lisa and Peter said. I think, Lisa, you said when you're selecting people, you look for the cultural aspects even more than the capabilities. And I would always say that with a team, with people that you bring on to these high risks, make sure these are people who have a passion for the work. And this gets into how do you measure that positive nature, the 3.5 to 1 notion. And what I found in working with a lot of teams in terms of projects is if they were excited about what they were doing, when they saw problems coming up, when they were even dealing with problems with each other, that positivity, that connection to the mission, that fact that they're representing the country, the world, their organization, their team, that would drive them towards making sure that they were successful. So I think it comes back to these team principles. Are you clear on the vision? Do you really love what you're doing to the point where it's more important for us to be successful? And that leads to that sense of positivity. Because the reality, wherever you work, I mean, you work at a place like NASA, you're still dealing with the same human issues. So if you don't love it, eventually you're going to get into trouble. So
let's take that thread a little bit more, Ed. So when we're talking about teams, we're looking at a new population, a new pipeline of talent that is emerging, that is in the generation spectrum. We're talking about millennials, right? So millennials now are the new anchor of the workforce development pipeline. And so what we're trying to think about now in the literature and in research is what is it that makes millennials tick? It evolves into 2 different themes. So there's the how and where these millennials want to work, and then there is the why are they coming to work? Why are they engaged, which you touched on a little bit. So Lisa, I'll turn to you specifically for the how and where, because it's a little bit difficult. Again, you have shore employees and you have ship employees. So for your ship employees, the how and where runs into a little bit of a barrier, because when we think about the research on millennials, one of the things that comes up is that they want maximum flexibility. They want to be able to work from home. They want to be part of a virtual team. They want autonomy on those teams. So you can tell me what I'm supposed to do, but I want you to leave me alone and don't micromanage me. When you have employees who are millennials and they're working in an environment like this, which is much more contained, and there is not as much flexibility to construct their work environment in the way they want. It is what it is, and you need to do the best job that you can. How are you able to attract and then retain this new emerging group of millennials in an environment like the ship?
Well, you know, one of my slides showed that we're a company that is made up of people on our ships and also people on shore. The people that choose to work on ships are doing it for a lot of different reasons that don't necessarily correlate to some of the things that we think about here in the United States as we're talking about millennials. The other thing I try to be very careful about, because I live my life doing that, is I try not to lump everyone into one bucket. So I don't, you know, I look at human beings as people who have different reasons for working in different places at different times based on their situation. Some of them happen to be millennials, but a lot of people that I've worked with on my own team who need a different situation for a period of time are not millennials. So I do believe that that balance or things that are happening in people's lives are not dictated by the generation they were born. But I also find it very difficult to separate the how and the where from the why. Because one of the things that I believe is really important to the millennials that I work with every day on shore is the what I care about aspect of how I try to lead. Because of any generation that I've ever worked with, millennials really care about what you care about to make sure that they're happy and want to stay in the workforce, or most importantly, in your brand or in your company. And so I can't tell you the number of people in our company, whether they work for Celebrity or not, based on the things that I try to do out in the world, that say to me, and many of them are millennials, how proud they are to work there. So when somebody is proud and has passion and cares about the vision, it's this magical combination that I believe transcends generation.
So Peter, can you unpack that a little bit more? Can you, in fact, separate the how and where from the why? Or is there much more of a focus, needing to be much more of a focus for millennials on the why and the purpose-driven motivation that they have for wanting to work somewhere, believing in the mission, believing in the leader, and that's good enough?
Yeah. Well, I think they're great questions, and I agree with everything you've said. And I have, most of my students are millennials, most of my staff are millennials. And it is hard to essentialize them. They come from all over the world. They have very different experiences and expectations. I agree with you that I think fundamentally meaning is important. A lot of the work that you do around diversity and gender diversity, racial, ethnic diversity, I know we see as a primary concern for sort of a better world that a lot of these young people have. But again, it varies. There is a lot of difference. I do think that one of the unique things with younger generations will be the tech social interface and what that means to them. You know, I was raised, I'll speak for myself, you know, at a time when cars and computers were introduced, and we started to sort of take that in. Well, this group, this millennium population, is really being raised at a time when they're embedded in technology in a way that we don't even understand. And the technology is changing at such a quick rate. And so their interests, their needs, and how they get their needs met, how they communicate with one another, how they date one another, all of that is really transforming. I have two young children, one is 24 and one is 21, and they are this population. And their culture is different, their needs are different, and how they get them met are different, and they change pretty quickly. And that's one of the things I've really been struck by, is how adaptive they are, I guess, how resilient they are in responding to changing technologies. But fundamentally in their core, they, like us, want to do meaningful work. They want to do things that resonate with them, that they see are important. But what those things are changing quickly in the world, and so they're having to respond and adapt to those.
So we find ourselves here in San Francisco, adjacent to Silicon Valley, and a unique aspect of the culture of excellence here in this region is not just about accepting failure, but expecting failure. So that is to say, if you are not failing frequently, then you're not doing what you need to be doing to drive an entrepreneurial culture. You are not doing thinking out of the box and pushing the envelope to really drive innovation and change. So Ed, I'll turn to you. So when you think about teams, and you think about whatever population across generations, millennials or otherwise, but teams, the core element of teams, if you want them to be entrepreneurial, if you want them to push the envelope, to drive change, to think outside the box, to do new and different things that will help the organization to advance for competitive advantage, but you're in an industry where safety is critical and you really can't fail, how do you motivate those teams to think out of the box and be innovative, but at the same time be very careful?
Yeah, I think it's a key question, because to me, when I look at teams or projects or how are they working together, one of the first things I look for is how do they talk about or respond to mistakes or failures. And what I've seen with teams that have had problems is if you talk about a mistake or a problem, they get like a deer with lights in their eye. They don't want to talk about it. You got a problem because they're going to start covering it up, and now you can't improve. And we've seen that before. So, and I think one of the things to talk about, I talked about the sound of success. I was talking to someone about one of the best managers NASA ever had, and this woman told me there was a sound of success of working on this person's mission. And I said, what are you talking about? You're getting very zen. What do you mean by the sound of success? I thought she was playing with. She said, you basically had people talking. They were walking around. They were fighting with each other. They weren't always agreeing. They were fighting. They were arguing. There was energy. And it made me remember the fact that the projects that I was sent into that had significant problems, when I'd ask them a question of, what's the biggest problem here? What's the biggest weakness? The ones that had the biggest problems or sometimes dysfunctions would say, everything is fine here. And it was like you're getting into this horror story. You know that there's a problem, but they don't want to acknowledge it. So I would listen for a team. Are they socializing? Are they partying? Are they laughing together? And are they able to disagree and fight and resolve it positively? That's that sound of success, and that's the vital thing, because most work is across lines. It's across disciplines. It's like designing a new ship. How do you change this? How do you get all these different people to work together? And so it's that kind of engagement and conversation that has to take place.
So I always think about fear of failure as an opportunity, because there are certain things you really shouldn't fail at, and that's, it's one thing to say, oh, we want to fail so we can learn and do better, but there's some things you really don't want to fail at. But as long as you operate in an environment where the fear of failure is very real, and you talk about what is the worst thing that can happen, and then how you plan for that. One of the best leaders that I've ever worked with that was working on a ship, when you're introducing a ship, you really can't fail, because your brand and your business is depending on it. So he would start his meetings every day with, don't tell me what's working, and don't tell me what we're doing well. Tell me what could happen. Tell me what the worst thing is that could happen today, and what we really have to worry about. And then you plan for that. And so I think that's also another way of getting at that failure question, so that teams aren't afraid to talk about failure. They actually openly talk about it so that you don't fail.
I think it's a really important question, this idea of failing fast, which is a Silicon Valley phenomenon. I think organizations of the future will need to do both. They'll need to probably, to some degree, separate and put a firewall between the functions that are looking at prevention, looking at operations, and really sort of dealing with business as it is, and the groups that need to think ahead. And what are the scenarios for failure? What can that look like? So it may be a kind of the distinction you made between robotics and others, but there is a mentality to gamers, to people that play computer games. They oftentimes, when they engage with a new computer game, they don't play it to win. They fail as much as possible to learn the rules of the game so they can master it, right? And so there's a lot to learn from that orientation to problem solving. And I think in order to sort of prevent the longer term problems, we're going to need groups and organizations that are thinking way ahead while we have the sort of mainstay of organizational functioning that is more traditional.
Well, it's managing the risk, because you're absolutely, I mean, if you're involved in loss of life, then you have to manage that very differently than if you're working a mission where a failure you can learn from and you can adapt from. Managing
And it's
the
clear
risk.
that the risk can be safety, but it could also be brand, brand preservation. So both of those apply.
And we manage risk every day with our global marine organization. Safety and reliability is at the forefront of everything we worry about every day, because failure is not good in those areas either.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the composition of teams. So we've talked about the evolution of collaboration and how that needs to change in order for teams to be more productive. When we talk about the composition, Lisa, one of the elements of diversity, of teams, is diversity. So you are a female who has risen through this industry unlike any other. You have been the minority on teams, gender-wise, and so you've had to manage expectations, you've had to train people up, you've had to train peers, you've had to lead down, so you've done it all through your rise to the top as CEO. What are you able to do now, having had that experience? And I know the answer to this, but for the people, what have you been able to do to help support other females and to create gender diversity, male and female, in the organization to be able to support that new collaboration team dynamic?
Well, first of all, you need to have the right position and the right influence to be able to affect real change in an organization, especially in a business like mine, which is highly operational. We run a hotel and marine organization, especially our marine organization that has historically been predominantly male, and it is all about being purposeful in what you do relative to any diversity that you are trying to create. And I try to create a lot of diversity. One that's very obvious for me is women, because we are so underrepresented in our company in a lot of different areas. And it always amazes me that women make up over 50% of the population, and yet such a small percentage in leadership roles and in politics. But you see women now raising their hand a lot more than you used to. So for me, to find women to bring into this business is not easy, but again, it has to be purposeful. And you have to have a team that's committed to the same thing that you are. So it can't only be important to me that gender diversity happens in a much bigger way. Patrick is our Senior Vice President of Marine. He's from Sweden, but he is the one that, based on our shared vision, has gone out and found so many women to work on our bridges across our fleets to go from 5% to 30%. Brian, who runs our hotel operation, and his team have gone out and found women leaders for our ships. When I first came back to the brand, there were no women hotel directors. We are working with our human resources organization to ensure that gender balance is better across all positions on the ships. Right now, only 17% of the crew on our ships are women for a lot of different reasons, and it's not because we exclude women, it's because we need women to opt in. So not only do I try to hire as many wonderful and capable women as I can, I really spend a lot of time encouraging women to raise their hand for some of these jobs, like when we work together and I talk to girls at Columbia for your STEM program. Unless women want to do these things, then we will never be able to find enough of them to get the right balance that we need.
It's important that you mention that, and I'll tell you all a story. So, but Lisa, going back to, it's not just about you giving the mandate to be more inclusive. Your people actually have to want to do it. Right. But I would argue that in order for them to want to do it, they have to know that the mandate is real, that it's coming from the leader's heart, that it really does matter to you, and that it's truly part of what you think is important for an organization. Not just because it's helpful to the bottom line, but because you think it's helpful in general. Right. So last summer, Columbia, we run the Columbia Girls in STEM Initiative. And the Columbia Girls in STEM Initiative is focused on supporting underserved high school girls, and we do it in 4 different cities, and Miami is one of the cities, and we worked with the Miami Dolphins, and it was sponsored also by Celebrity Cruises. And the girls had the opportunity to visit with Lisa. She spoke to them, and they got a chance to meet with her. But prior to you coming, Lisa, these girls did not believe that this woman was a CEO. They didn't believe that the CEO of Celebrity Cruises was a woman, and they didn't believe that you had hired Captain Kate, who pulls all those levers and pistons and majored in physics and has a PhD in something scientific and technological. So you being able to talk with them, hand out your business card, answer their questions, be real to them was something that they felt that it was coming from your heart, but it was also something they were able to see in real life, that this is something that I can do, and that was really special for them. So thank you for that.
Special for me too.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. So my point is, you have to really believe it in your heart in order to be able to transition into your team. Peter, let me transition to you, diversity and composition of teams. So in addition to gender diversity, we also want to have cultural diversity, global diversity. I know you do a lot of work with the UN and other NGOs. When you bring different cultures, different races, different languages together on teams, what impact does that have, and how do you facilitate making sure that those differences don't become the problem?
Really good question. So when you bring highly diverse teams together to work together, there are short-term consequences and long-term consequences, or short-term effects and long-term. The short-term effects it's hard, because it's hard when you're at Columbia University and you just bring a physicist with an anthropologist and a psychologist. They don't know how to talk to each other, right? Because they're sort of trained in very different worlds, right? You know what I'm talking about. But when you really work at the UN and you bring people to America or to Geneva who've never left West Africa before in their life, there is a difficult phase of trying to figure out how to do that. Now, many of these multinational organizations or institutions tend to create a climate of politeness and respect to try to navigate that. They also tend to create a climate that's very hierarchical, so that everybody knows the rules, who's in charge and who's not in charge, and that helps alleviate some of the anxiety around difference. But ultimately what we found, because we've worked with the UN for 25 years, is that they need the cooperative goals, they need the capacity to negotiate across these differences. You can't just sort of say, get along, folks. It really does come down to, well, what does that look like in your culture, and what does that look like in yours, and can we create a way to work in this team that works for us? So it does take work, but the payoffs are great, because particularly in a place like the United Nations or any kind of international organization, if your market is international, if you don't understand the market, if you don't have people that intimately understand that, then you're at a loss. So the payoffs of a diverse team or organization are extraordinary if you can find the right conditions where people can work together respectfully and trust, establish that trust and positivity.
So Ed, let's talk a little bit more about that. So continue on the thread of establishing that trust. Often the criticism that leaders get when they form teams and they try to develop these teams as diverse units is that it's just done for show. It's done for the brochure, for the magazine, for the website. It has the right tapestry, it looks good, but it's not real. So how do you develop a diverse team so that it is real, so that there is trust, and so that the metrics for how that team was constructed, why they were constructed, and how they can actually execute on the goals is something that is going to contribute to the bottom line again, and not just a response to a lack of diversity?
Yes, I would say a few things. I feel strong about that, partly because of my NASA experience. I also graduated from Peter's program, not when Peter's younger than me, but Morton Deutsch was my professor, and so you come from that framework. Number one, NASA. My experience over 33 years. NASA is a highly successful organization. 90% of its work is done through supply chain organizations. And so you get organizations like SpaceX, like Boeing, like Grumman, like Blue Origin, very different. I mean, very different players, but they have to come together. But you can tap into that expertise. 80% of every program is an international collaboration. So you have Europeans, you have Russians, you have folks who have to work together, and everything is done for science, even though the engineers hate thinking about that, and that's done at universities. So the success of the organization when it works is that you can tap into capability and partnering from the best in the world, The challenge is that next thing, which is how do you get people to work together? And so I'd say the second thing I would find is leadership engagement. Teams that work, whether it's a dean or a CEO or the captain of a ship, if they're disconnected from the goals or the team, that team will start withering away because there's a lack of clarity, and then we go into our own direction. So I look at the second thing is the leadership engaged in what's happening. And then I think third nowadays, and again, it's why I'm excited about the Columbia partnership, is everything is can you learn fast? The technologies change, constantly. The designs change very quickly. The data and the analytics say to go in this direction. And when you have teams of people can adapt and they have a passion and they want to go there, they're going to be successful. If you have people who it's very hard for them to unlearn anything, they're staying in this place, it's very hard for that success. So the diversity is a good thing. You need to have engaged leaders, and you have to be able to learn very quickly.
So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us for this special edition of Talks at Columbia, Redefining Teamwork, the Evolution of Collaboration. I want to thank you, Lisa, first and foremost, for hosting us on the Celebrity Infinity. This is a wonderful ship and a wonderful crew. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Lisa, for your remarks today. And we will see you all again on another ship at another time.
Yes.